Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance at this session today. I hope you had a good networking session and had a chance to get some cold water. It's a very hot day, as we all know. This is probably one of the few times when I envy David Beckham wearing a sarong all those years ago, as I was told.
Feel free.
And if I had one, I probably would be wearing it. But anyway, welcome, everybody. We are now moving, as you are in this room, onto the panel sessions, which we've had this morning a number of discussions, but we now are focusing on the NEAT challenge in some specific areas. We are going to explore in this session today whether place-based approaches can help reduce the number of NEATs and what local authorities can do to support young people. As we know, where a young person grows up can have very profound limiting chances on that young person's life. So this panel session is going to examine how NEAT rates vary dramatically across the country. I think you heard Alan this morning talking about the Blackpool having one of the highest rates in the country, I think alongside Derby, but there is a range of rates all around the country, the very lowest ones in and around London. But this does raise some pretty important questions. Is this principally an education problem? Is it a labour market problem? Or is it a broader sort of place problem? And if place matters, are we giving local leaders enough freedom to respond to local circumstances? And even if we did give them more powers at a local level, do they have the institutional ability currently to take that power and use it well? So the Social Mobility Commission over the past couple of years has increasingly highlighted the importance of place-based approaches. And last year we published 2 reports with very long names, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I think some of them you had on your seats. Regional Insight, Creating Fairer Chances Across the Regions. And the one that I chaired was Innovation, Investment and Inclusion, a Framework for Regional Renewal. Both of these weren't specifically about NEATs, but they did touch on the challenges. So there does still remain a very live debate about how much should be decided nationally against locally, and we will get into some of that. Today, we have an excellent panel to explore these questions. But if you do have any questions, please hold on to them. You will have an opportunity later to get involved. And also, I'm told, don't forget to share your thoughts from the day on social media. Tag Social Mobility Commission and use hashtag Social Mobility Symposium. So if you are tweeting, please do that. So let me begin by introducing our panel. Firstly, it's my pleasure to welcome Baroness Stedman-Scott, who is a distinguished Conservative politician who served as Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the DWP and also at the Cabinet Office. We also have Anna Dawe, they're all sitting in order, this is marvellous, who has over 30 years experience in further education and has been Principal/CEO of Wigan and Leigh College for a decade. She's also chair of the Greater Manchester Colleges Partnership, and she actively shapes skills policy to drive local opportunity. And then we have, and I'm told I can call you Nish Mayer.
No, you can call me Nick.
Nish. Yeah, who is the Director of Employer Engagement and Partnerships at Youth Futures Foundation. And finally, we have Paul O'Neill, the Development Director of the Steve Morgan Foundation, who has led a £100 million strategy focused on place-based systems change and education. So those are the introductions. That is the brilliant panel we have at our disposal today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them a first question, and I'm just going to go down the line and get them to give us their thoughts on the question. So we've talked about the varying rates of NEATs across the country. From your perspective, what specific local barriers do national one size fits all, I should say, policies consistently overlook when trying to support young people who are NEAT? So I'm going to go along the panel and I'm going to give you a reasonable amount of time to both answer that, but also maybe throw in some other things that you might want to as part of that. So, Debbie, first.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I'm pleased to be sharing this session with you. When you talk about barriers, my philosophy, is quite clearly that the principles of any service that young people receive should be set nationally, the design and delivery should be set locally, and the impact should be felt personally, and it should make a difference. And so it's when government, so I'm digging myself in a hole here, but it's when governments say, we want you to do this, we want you to do it like this, this and this, and we want it everywhere over the country. And that just does not work. And so, the actual service being dictated to by central government, what it should be doing is turned up on its head. We should say in a place, I'll give you an example. When I was at my charity, I was asked to go to a place called Heathfield in East Sussex. There were 42 young people excluded from school, and no matter what anybody did, they weren't getting anywhere. So what can you do for these 42 young people? So we went and met them, and we found out what the problems were. One was living in the woods in a tent because his mum had got a new bloke, and the new bloke didn't like him, so they chucked him out. He was living in the woods. So if we didn't solve where he lived, we weren't going to get anywhere with him. We also had a young girl who discovered her father wasn't away working, he was actually at Her Majesty's pleasure. And once she found out, she got very angry about that. She was enrolled in a college course. She was on the bus going to college, and somebody took the mickey out of her, so she decked her. And she got in big trouble for it, ended up in court. And until we solved that, until we dealt with that, those people were not going to make any progress in their life. So the barriers are, it's got to be individual, not nationally dictated, and we've got to be judged on our outcomes. What would be a good outcome for that young person would be very different to what would be an outcome for that young lad. So the young lad in the woods wanted to work outside. He wanted to be in a business that was outside, not anything else. We went to a landscape company, got him the job there, found him somewhere to live. He worked on the team that had got gold at the Chelsea Flower Show. And when he went to number 11 for a reception, he told the Chancellor, every time I take my van out, I get you 55 quid in VAT. So, that's we died and gone to heaven, we got the job. So that might be a very basic answer, but that's the principle. It's focused on the young person.
And how important is the outcome? Is that something that, in these devolution deals, do you have to be very specific about what the outcomes are going to be?
I think you have to have some idea, and you have to articulate what the outcome is. I learned very quickly, getting somebody into a job is an output, keeping them in the job is an outcome. And everything that I did in my career prior to going into the House of Lords was based on getting somebody into work and keeping them there. And the other thing, the lesson I learned a very hard way was that when you get someone a job who's got multiple problems, when you get them a job, and you think, that's it, I'll walk away. Don't do that. We gave them the same mentor for a year afterwards, and that's why we've got 76% of our people still in work after a year.
Very briefly, before I move on, devolution. How important is more devolution in making things more locally responsive?
Well, the people in this room will deliver services to young people, I've no doubt. You'll spend more time talking about where the money's coming from than anything else. And so making sure budgets are devolved, but people can apply for them based on doing the right thing is important. So it's very important. It's very important that we devolve these things. And it's very important that we make sure that there's adequate money to do the job properly. So all the things I've talked to you about, I did through social impact bonds.
Yes.
And they were terrific.
I remember social reforms very, very well.
Yeah.
I was the minister responsible for them at the time.
Well,
I was. They did make a difference.
yeah.
So let's move to Anna. So you've got a specifically sort of further education perspective on this. So what are the barriers you're seeing?
Okay, well, I suppose obviously I'm going to be unashamedly education focused on this and leave my colleagues to pick up other aspects of it. But I think actually we are in a position now where the NEET conversation needs to fundamentally change. We are, I think, in a perfect storm. I think we have problems with our curriculum, and I mean probably Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 school, college and beyond. I think we have problems with AI that has come along and we haven't responded well to that. We are also at the same time picking up post-COVID impact with many of our young people, and that has had an impact on mental health as well. So what we are suddenly seeing is almost a perfect storm that is affecting our NEET young people. And I think the other thing we need to be very careful of when we recount, I suppose, our examples or experience of the NEET cohort is that cohort has changed. Many of the young people that we see, yes, they may have problems with the housing, they may have significant problems in terms of having a settled family life, but we're also now seeing level 2 qualified young people from school, NEET. We are seeing young people who are level 1, level 2, even level 3 completers who are going into NEET statistics. So there is an opportunity now that all of those things have created a perfect storm, that we have to actually look at what we do differently and look at the cohort of NEET differently. It is not how it always was. So what does that mean? Well, for me, the national policy, the one for all policy, is mainly for education still not meeting need. And you could argue it's not met need for a long time. We have systematically taken away technical pathways out of Key Stage 4. So we have young people in mandatory schooling up to the age of 16 who don't thrive in an academic-based curriculum and spend much of those formative years feeling they're not achieving or not finding their passion and not developing the skills. So we're seeing more absence from school, more turning away from school because it isn't engaging them. At post-16, we see a technical education system which is reformed almost on average every 2 to 3 years. Yeah. It is never settled. And that is because ideologically, many of our governments have struggled with what is technical education, and they repeatedly try to make it more like academic study under the name of rigour. And unfortunately, that continues to sometimes turn off those young people who've struggled through school when they get to college, when they're really trying to find that vocation. So that churn isn't helping as well. And we currently have a programme of reform that is, because it hasn't actually been planned properly, has actually meant that some people have left college at level 2, qualified to level 2, and have no progression pathway at 17 to level 3 because there is not a level 3 option between the T levels. The B levels haven't come along and their BTECs have been withdrawn. So that, again, has created a problem. The other aspect is that quite often with technical education, it is harder to deliver the opportunities because unlike academic study, my college does do A-levels, I did A-levels, I love A-levels, this isn't an anti-A-level thing, but it is about having choice. A-levels involve a teacher and a student, a provider and a student. Technical education, good technical education to give opportunities, you need a provider, college, a sixth form, or a private training provider. You need the student, pupil, and you need an employer. And to make technical education opportunities rich, quality, strong quality, and available, you have to have those 3 elements linked up. And there is another barrier. Engagement of employers, partly due to lack of information, but also economic realities of what some of them can do. Young people at Key Stage 4 being given the right information that progresses them into Key Stage 5 technical education in a clear way so they find their place. And ultimately making sure that they've got those opportunities. Can devolution respond to some of those challenges? Firstly, we don't have devolution across the whole of the country. So that immediately is going to create differentials from area to area. I'm in Wigan. It's a post-deindustrialised town, high employment, low wage, huge engagement with apprenticeships, one of the highest in the country. But we are also part of Greater Manchester, and we did have a mayor up until last week, and we currently don't have one. I don't know what's happened to him. But under devolution, our mayor has championed technical education. He has championed its value, its worth, its place in our economy. He has taken, that person has taken technical learners and placed them in his vocabulary and the way he's taught them up and the way he's taught technical education in Greater Manchester on equal footing with our academic students, that they all have something to give. They all can engage and be active and contribute to our community. And in Greater Manchester, I think technical students, whether they are level 1 or level 3 or level 2, or whether they are plumbers, whether they are hairdressers, whether they are caterers, whether they are health and social care students, they walk an inch taller because employers, devolution, our local authorities, our institutions that deliver technical education are now part of the discussion. We are on the map, and it is now a legitimate pathway. And I think that devolution, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about it, has been able to actually create something that we haven't created before in my 30 years in education.
Can I just, you mentioned the curriculum and you were concerned about the changes. Are those the recent changes, or is it the just constant churn over the years where curriculum has been changed almost, as you say, every year?
It's constant churn, but some of the problems are new and some of the problems are old. We have had since, certainly over the last 10 years, our approach to apprenticeships. And I'm really pleased some politicians have attached onto apprenticeships, but when they talk about them, they then talk about degree apprenticeships. That's great. We do degree apprenticeships. They're fabulous. But what about apprenticeships at level 2 and 3? Because that's where we talk about real social mobility. Okay, so apprenticeship access for 16 to 18-year-olds has diminished, and that's been happening for a long time. My college, and this is a depressing stat, is only one of 5 FE colleges in the country that has over 500 16 to 18 apprentices. One of 5. Now, that is not a good place for us to be. So that, I think, is one area. T-levels are just, I have to say, I think wonderful, because we see our young people from our T-levels go into work. They do get degree apprentices. Their placement is just worth its weight in gold, I cannot tell you. They are, for me, phenomenal students and phenomenal qualifications. However, they're not easily accessible. They're not as accessible as BTECs. You have to have higher grade GCSEs. You have to have your maths and English. We still have 50% in the north of our young people leave school missing either maths or English. It's not easy to do a resit with them. So T-levels have an accessibility issue. We've got to do something about that. So that leaves some young people with no pathway at level 3. So when you've got, and those are just 2 examples, when you've got that sort of reform that is creating accessibility issues, that drives or can drive need. It's an unintended consequence that needs to be looked at, brought back, and just reviewed again.
Brilliant. We will come back to some of that. Nish, so you come from, I suppose, you work with employers a lot, so you've got quite an employer perspective. Where do you see the barriers from your perspective?
Well, I think when you look at, a one-size-fits-all question in relation to employers, or indeed all of us here, all is different. So if you think, we've had a big conversation this morning about young people, over 1 million young people, 1 in 8 young people. When you look at that locally in places, that is different. And so you can't think of the solution as a one-size-fits-all when place has its beauty and its disadvantage, when you've got young people who face significant barriers because of the additional challenges that they face. So, for example, around 14% of Black Afro-Caribbean young people are more disadvantaged when you look at the NEET population overall. You're twice as likely to be NEET if you come from the health system. And actually, if you've had experience of the criminal justice system, around sort of only 19% are in employment after 6 months after they leave an institution. So all of these things are complex. And so you can't treat, I suppose, the overall challenge in a one-size-fits-all approach. I think also when you think of employers, and actually to the question around the place and collaboration, actually it takes time. And all the actors in a place are fundamental to actually shifting the dial. And youth voice is also incredibly important. I mean, actually understanding for young people what those barriers are and also the environment they're in. I'm not sure they would all quote the story we heard this morning about the alarm clock, for example. I think they would give a very different kind of picture to what that place and environment has for them. We do a big program of work called Connected Futures, which is looking at local systems change in places. So working with young people, we've worked before Right to Succeed, and actually other community organisations in places on the ground. And actually what you need is that co-creation from the get-go and actually embedding real kind of system change from the beginning. Somebody used the phrase the other day to me, spaghetti, not confetti, which is like, let's deliver these national programmes out there as opposed to the spaghetti. That's the hard bit. Like national ambition is there, but when you get local, deploying that programme at a local level, and I do think devolution gives us an opportunity to do that, is being needs-led from the young people who are in those places, and the employers are part of the solution. Because if they can co-create those opportunities, I think that's where you see a kind of real benefit. We've got a programme up in Walsall and Leeds and Bradford, particularly looking at supporting Pakistani and Bangladeshi young people find employment and actually sustain employment, high levels of discrimination in terms of workplace culture in certain employment, but getting them as part of the solution, having them there from the get-go, bringing those early work encounters into those communities, raising awareness with certain communities about technical and vocational routes in to employment is really important because for some cultures, for example, that might not be something that they necessarily see as viable if university isn't actually an option. So I don't think you can take a one-size-fits-all. I think it's hard for employers because they don't have those kind of nuances. And actually, when you look at the data under that overall kind of neat statistic, it is nuanced. We need to think about that in order to shift the system because, let's face it, it hasn't shifted for a long time.
And just as a follow-up, how difficult do you find it trying to get employers involved in the first place? Is it really the co-creation of training?
I think at a local level, it's the fear of not necessarily understanding what the problem is. So we've got vacancies, why isn't anyone, applying from certain communities and what have you? So there's something about a genuine kind of level of kind of misunderstanding. There's also inadvertently barriers in the hiring processes that don't need to be there. So actually, when you look at kind of some of the entry level opportunities, could they make it an apprenticeship actually? Back to what I was saying, could they make it a level 2 and level 3 and really think of the skills that are needed? What do they need versus what we can train in terms of young people? So I think there's an element of actually understanding the levers that they have within their own organisation to shift. And I think creating those pathways is one way to do that.
So, Paul, you bring quite a unique perspective to this. Again, probably a different perspective to others on the panel. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so hopefully I can bring a bit of a multi-lens perspective on this. Of originally being a youth worker on some of these national type of NEET programmes, although sadly the youth aspect of that has left me now. Being a senior leader, working with Youth Futures Foundation colleagues on system redesign around NEET, and then more presently working for a philanthropic foundation, looking at how we best use our resource in partnership with other statutory services and voluntary sector services to create the biggest social impact and give young people a chance at having a good life. And I think based on my experience of these various different roles within the system, the national one-size-fits-all policies, they often tend to overlook place-specific, lived and structural barriers that vary significantly from locality to locality. So if we go back, and hopefully no one will fact check me in the audience, but if we go back to when the term NEET was introduced, it started to get a bit more popular in the mid-90s, and then the Social Exclusion Unit then introduced the term NEET then in the landmark report at that time, which was Bridging the Gap. Now, for those who've been around long enough to have read Bridging the Gap or been exposed to it, you remember from that report that the insight still holds today. So NEET was highlighted as a system failure, not at the individual young person level, but young people become neat when those systems are weak and transitions are weak and they don't work well together. So over a quarter of a century on, we're sat here again today talking about the same issue. It's more pressing than ever, and we've got no solution. So it's great everyone's around here today sharing their insights, think how we can do things differently. And I think for local authority colleagues in the room, you'll be very familiar with the RONI, or risk and need indicators, and think about how we measure need in relation to that. And various government departments also support some of that information. But essentially that was developed as a tracking tool by local authorities to try and make some sense of the need problem. But when you look at it, only a small percentage of the risk and need indicators are actually about individual skills. So the majority of those risks sit in those structural factors, such as poverty, family context, SEND and system failures. That will be very different from locality to locality. So when we're thinking about designing programs on this, if there's only 10 to 20% of those risk and need indicators that are linked to individual factors, what support, what long-term plan, what strategy do we need to support places to tackle some of the others? Because young people, we can build their agency and capability, but if those structural and systemic issues that sit around them in their local context continue to exacerbate the issues they're facing, we're still going to have the same conversation 25 years later on. So I think as vital a role as skills programs play, and I've delivered them, and I think they're really important, they won't alone shift the need rates at scale. So we need place-based, multi-agency intervention that tackles the context as well as supporting the young people. And I think from a place perspective, there's probably sort of 5 to 6 key aspects that we need to think about. So some colleagues have alluded to some of those things, but firstly about local labour markets. So we've talked, there's been a lot of focus on Blackpool because Blackpool is a place where lots of these issues around need crystallise, but coastal or post-industrial areas, the issue there isn't just skills. It's that the jobs are available, are low paid, insecure, or simply not there at all. So any policies there that focus purely on upskilling, they're just not going to cut it. We're going to end up in the same issue. And the second one is around access. So even where opportunities exist, young people aren't aware of them or aren't able to access them. So that might be around transport costs, poor connectivity, even things like low car ownership or access to public transport. So they can make your job placement unpredictable or inaccessible. So again, from a policy perspective, looking from space, we can think that actually that could be well implemented there, but actually if we don't understand the local context, we can't tweak that policy to make it fit for purpose. And then we have to think about things like the local infrastructure. So some communities don't have that basic ecosystem that we're used to. So things like job centres, youth clubs, childcare or coordinated services. And even where they do exist, some of them are very fragmented. So there's not that connectivity for the young people, particularly as you reach that 16 to 18 age group, where all that support drops off and you're supposed to be an adult. But actually, a lot of your upbringing to that point has not enabled you to have those skills, capabilities to survive and thrive on your own. And then the fourth one is around that fragmented support, and this varies by postcodes. We've talked a lot about careers guidance, but again, we alluded to there around what it takes for technical skills and technical vocational support to be in place. There's so many actors that need to work in synergy together, that even if one of them are missing, or the wraparound support isn't there to allow that, then those can fall down quite quickly, even though from a distance it looks as if they're present. And then the hidden cost of participation for young people, so travel, food, equipment, unpaid placements, they're all small cost individually, but because we're looking at these million figures, we miss the fact that they're not a homogenous group. And for some young people, just that bus fare or just that lunch money is the thing that stops them getting to that work placement. And that's where some of the voluntary sector services are key in terms of recognising that and supporting them. And then finally, there's the lived context. So things like family responsibilities, unstable home lives, mental health needs and SEND, they all shape whether a young person can engage. And quite often, health are absent from this conversation. And when we look at some of the areas where we've got the highest rates, we've also got the lowest life expectancy or the kind of biggest health issues. Now, you're not telling me those health issues start in adulthood. Those young people have been going through some of those things. And actually, we need everyone around the table to try and solve this issue. So for me, I think the core takeaway is that it's a place-based systems issue. And I think national policy is so often underperformed because it abstracts away the things that actually the things that might be able to help us shift the dial on this issue.
So you being a foundation, you bring a quite different perspective, and you focus specifically on the northwest, as I understand it. Do you think that if there were foundations in every part of the country doing this connectivity, bringing that different perspective, do you think that would be a big help?
I think so. I don't think philanthropy is the only solution. Like, I don't think government is the only solution. But I think this move to thinking about the impact economy and how everyone can stop bombarding places with interventions that are almost like Frankenstein's monster bolted on top of each other. And actually, no one wants to stop doing anything in case the one thing they stop doing is the one thing that's working. There's a national conversation and a regional conversation to look at. We all want the same thing, regardless of which way we're looking at it. We want the greatest impact for the investment that we're putting in for our young people. So how do we get ahead of this and start to work together so that some of our parts are greater? And that, for me, there won't be a philanthropist like Steve Morgan in every area, but there will be national philanthropic foundations who are kind of place agnostic and are actually really interested in going and supporting where the need is. So I think we need to think about how do we harness that impact economy. And I know the government, we've been working with the Cabinet Office and DCMS around the Office for the Impact Economy, but I think they're so overwhelmed because this is so overdue that there's going to be a lag before we start to see the impact on that. But that joined up partnership approach where everyone can agree on a North Star of we want young people to have a great future in this country, I think is a starting point that everyone can get behind. So yeah, the long-winded answer to your question, I think that is definitely the way forward.
Right. Okay, so we've had a really interesting introduction from everybody. I've got a good roundup of broadly what your views are. I'm going to come back to you, Debbie, first to talk to you about because a lot of the barriers and solutions we've just discussed are clearly local to a large extent. And I asked you about devolution, and I want to drill into that in a bit more detail in the sense that what mechanism or mechanisms do you believe are needed to shift power away from Whitehall, where it is still very much over-centralised still as a country, so that we can give local leaders more autonomy to adopt those national schemes with a much more local flavour? How do we do that better than we're doing it at the moment?
That's a good exam question. I mean, when you talk about devolution, you are talking about a national programme that's got a budget attached to it, and people will bid for it. They'll bring the money in and they'll be told what to do. The best things I've ever seen work are not national programmes. They're not dictated to by central government, but they are designed and delivered locally based on what young people need. So, as I said to you, the biggest conversations people around this table will have is about where they get the money to do what they know to be right. And that's the thing that will keep you awake at night. So somewhere along the line, we've got to say, what do we want? What are people going to buy from us that's going to make a difference? And you've heard lots of small things, or not small in size, but lots of different things that make a difference. For me, what's important in a locality is that somebody, some organisation holds the ring for young people, and that they are the constant factor. And if we could just get away from saying you've got to do this for money, but if the money is there, what's the outcome that they want? Now, as far as needs are concerned, there's a multiple level of outcomes. So if they're back in education with you, that's a major step forward. If they're engaged with an employer, that's another great part of the jigsaw. And if at the end of the day, having got somebody that's going to support them and be their mentor right throughout it, that's the package that I see is needed. So a consistent, stable mentor, okay, that holds the ring for that person, that has the relationship with the education, that has the relationship with the employer. And when something isn't working, they go back to that mentor to resolve it and resolve it quickly. And I don't know that I've described that well enough. My friends in the front row smiling at me, I might have achieved some of it, but it isn't a national programme, it isn't a national bid. But if I'm looking after this person here, I'm with them and I've got them into your college, it's the dialogue between us to keep them there to achieve. It's the dialogue with the employer. And the minute something goes wrong, we're there. We had, let me tell you, we had a programme, Unipart, the car component people. They said, we've never taken a NEET or an unemployed person in our lives. Find 12 and we'll bring them into our workforce. And we found 12, and a young girl got the job of taking all the executives travel in Unipart. They were going all around the world. I mean, she died and gone to heaven with this job. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, she turned up. Friday, no show. So what did we do? We went and knocked on her door. What are you up to? She came down in her pyjamas. What are you up to, sweetheart? She said, well, I never went to school on Fridays. Nobody ever told me off. So I thought I didn't have to go to work. So you get dressed. Took her back to work. Second week, same thing happened. Third week, she turned up. She's away. To me, it's that's the golden gem in the thing. And if you can just leave people to do that you can trust, I think you can make a big difference.
Yeah, there are lots of conversations going on about how you can keep more money generated locally at a local level, for example.
Yeah.
And there's also lots of conversation about how you can increase the levels of devolutions for skills, for example. And I just wonder whether either of those are attractive to you or the Conservative Party who you represent, or is that something that you haven't really?
So just let me be clear on this. The devolution of money is one thing. If I could do what I wanted to do, all right, as a member of the public, as somebody who's run a not-for-profit organisation, as somebody who's working with Helen Whately on policy at the minute, I would tell people don't take a penny of government money. Because if you take that money, you've got to do what they tell you. You're not able to do what the young person needs. Now, that's heresy. So how do we take the chains off of that money to enable you to do what those young people want? Very attractive.
Thank you. Anna, so just building on this notion of local autonomy, there appears to be a mismatch between what's taught in many areas and what local businesses actually want in the local area. How do you think we can align those things much better, and perhaps some examples of where you're doing it?
I mean, the curriculum that we teach or the qualifications that we teach are set at a national level and they are consistent, and you have to have that consistent standard. I think what we've been able to do, and qualifications somehow always lag as well what employers want, because they'll always be responding, won't they? So you do have to, as an institution, you've got to try and bridge that gap. You've got to try and be creative in that. And what we have been able to do, partly because of devolution, is we've been able to be more responsive. So, for example, we have had a campaign across Greater Manchester through the Combined Authority, through devolution, where they have generated an extra 1,000 T-level placements. Placements are such a key part of being able to give young people that work experience, taste, and also quite often then the employer buys into them and they keep them on post-employment. So where we have as institutions found it difficult to generate placements, our Combined Authority has actually come alongside us and helped generate an extra 1,000. So immediately our T-levels are doing really well. It is a national curriculum, everyone's delivering the same T-levels, but ours are thriving because we can get the placements to make the pathways and the offer broad in areas that may otherwise not be offered because we wouldn't get that engagement. We've had the ability to take, I'll give you one example, in Wigan, one of the big employers is Heinz. I'd say foot soup and mayonnaise and God knows what else. We ran a care leaver programme with them, and because the Adult Social Fund is devolved, we were able to shape a completely unique programme that there isn't a formal qualification for. We were able to take modules of things and put it together for a programme that worked for Heinz, but also for the care leavers. And we work with the local authority to find 10 young care leavers to actually then train mentors in the workplace in Hinds. And we actually did a programme with those young people, and the successful young people stayed on and got an apprenticeship through Hinds. That programme would not have been funded at a national level ordinarily, because it was to recognise full qualification. It was modules put together, and we got funded because they were post-18 but pre-age 24. They were on NEET, they were care leavers, but because of devolution, we were able to create a qualification, in effect, that actually placed them on the right pathway. So you can't always tweak the national curriculum, you can't always tweak the qualifications you've given, but it is about providers having that impetus to be able to work with collaborations that bring that extra value to the qualifications that we have. If you combine with that the fact that we have free bus travel for every 16 to 18-year-old in Greater Manchester as well under devolution, that is a huge, huge barrier removed. And it means that when we do get those placements, when we do get that employer engagement, our young people are much more able to actually go to that employer and actually be able to sustain those flexibilities in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do.
Brilliant. Nish, let's continue on a similar theme, but we've heard quite a bit about the need for local flex and employer alignment, but quite often that runs counter to how budgets work, as I think Debbie slightly picked up.
I mean, with employers?
Yes, yeah. So how can local government, schools and employers overcome that and create this sort of smooth pathway for young
Big
people?
question.
It is a big question.
Yeah, I mean,
Glad you got.
I know. Yeah, so I guess very simply with employers, I don't know, we've probably got many in this room today, like when they plan their workforce strategies, they don't do it in December and it kicks off in January. Like this stuff is planned years in advance. I met with a HR director from one of our high street coffee shops quite recently, and 2027 product range was aligned in 2025 and workforce plans were put out to deliver that. So there is something how employers are thinking longer term in terms of what they need. And actually it is harder sometimes to flip a switch and do stuff differently from, just an encounter with a young person, with a college, with a community group. I think the key thing employers need to do differently is in their organisation, they will have whole reams of people doing community outreach. They will have lots of individuals in their organisations that will be, whose very job is there to engage with the community, to provide work experience opportunities. Maybe not enough, but doing some of that stuff, but connecting the dots into building a talent pipeline for the organisation. So how does that early work encounter experience then lead to something that's maybe a little bit more specific on a skill or an interest for that young person, that then leads into a conversation about vocational training at a level that is accessible for that young person. So there is a little bit of kind of, for want of a better word, knitting and stitching, I think, with employers in terms of you're doing lots of good stuff over here, but actually how is it building into you thinking about your workforce plans and where your talent should come from. So I do think that's quite an interesting area to think about. I think the other thing as well with many employers is that we talk about vocational training, technical training, and we look at the degree route as well. Actually, we are not supporting many young people take a vocational route like we do for an academic degree route as well, in terms of what it costs for that young person to do the training, all the sorts of things that are associated with them coming on that journey. So from an employer's perspective, some of the flexibility that you can offer in terms of combining learning and learning together, and actually thinking more flexibly in terms of some of the disadvantages that I talked about earlier in terms of what that might mean for that young person, or the wraparound support that's needed at the get-go. I think those are the sorts of things that employers can think about and actually do pan out differently when you look at a technical vocational route through to perhaps what we see for a more traditional uni route as well.
And before I come to questions from the audience, Paul, just one final thing for you. we've talked a lot about geography and place-based work, and place-based work requires a sort of long-term stability. How do we successfully transition from short-term pilot funding to sustainable long-term local models?
Well, I think the reality is we don't move from short-term pilots to sustainable local or regional models simply by extending funding cycles. So I think that's important. There's nothing you can do really in 6 months or a year to change 30 years of endemic poverty or more. So we need to recognise that. But I think what we need to do is fundamentally change the system that the funding sits within. And that system for us, and we're biased, is inherently place-based by nature. And I think we're fortunate as a foundation that we've got a significant endowment due to our founder Steve Rollins' generosity, where we can look 25 years into the future. But we framed our shift, seeing that despite everyone's best efforts over the previous 25 years, outcomes have got worse for children and families in many ways, that we need to move from transactions to infrastructure, and then from funding programmes to building place-based systems that can support opportunities and sustain them after the individual grants end. And I think, we hear the same, the Bridge and the Gap report said the same, the Milburn Review said the same, the Social Mobility Commission says the same about persistent generational disadvantage across areas. But it gets us to the same conclusion. Where you grow up still fundamentally determines your life outcomes. When you look from a big data perspective, we have the individual hero stories that we often hang on to that helps us ignore some of the structural issues. But actually, when you look at that big data from a social mobility perspective, very, very difficult if you're falling into the bottom quintile to move up to the top, and vice versa, actually. So the question, I think, for us becomes, how do we build local systems that are strong enough to overcome that? And I think there's probably 5 things. So one is around moving from pilots, so these overly prescriptive pilots, to long-term anchored systems in place. So the pilot can create some innovation, but it can't create stability. And we know the best programs are relational, intensive, and rooted in those communities. And they've already started to plan how they're going to be there beyond that initial catalytic funding. So for us at Seymour Foundation, that's led to some clear conclusions. So one is around, we've got to develop the agency and capability of young people, but also simultaneously the systems and structures that sit around them. The second one is, if you want those seamless pathways, you need multi-year place-based commitments. So we're talking 3, 5, 10-year funding. Now the evidence around place-based change is pretty nascent, and that's because people don't want to pay for the evaluation for the kind of decade that it's going to take to see population level change. And generally, we have changes of government within that period of time, so people lose interest when the report comes out anyway. But in terms of institutional memory, sometimes, as a country, we're not great around that. But if you want workforce stability, you need confidence in funding horizons at that local level as well. So, particularly voluntary sector organisations need to know that they've got support beyond that. And then if you want system change, you need to align strategies within and across places. So if you don't do that, you're just going to create churn. So part of our work recently is thinking about, how do we work more closely with the provider authority and the individual local authorities to look at what their local growth plans are, look at what the local labour market analysis is saying, and look at how our kind of suite of interventions that we're supporting can actually create jobs that are available for people within that community as well. I think there's something about moving from delivery to shared local ownership, and that being a collective issue across statutory and the voluntary sector services, and being co-invested at that design stage. So not just coming in afterwards, because I think from a philanthropic perspective, it feels sometimes that we use the statutory backfill when there's run out of money or ideas to how we're going to deliver this big policy plan. Actually, if we're involved in the beginning, we could both be part of the first lost capital, or to help sustain government interventions beyond that initial pilot phase. And that alignment matters because we start to then reduce duplication, reduce inefficiency, and stop the Frankenstein's monster approach that I talked about previously. And I think for us at Seymour Foundation, employment's central. So family foundations are generally in the image of their founder, and Steve went to 9 different schools, lived in 9 different homes, and was kicked out at 16. I think he's very passionate about employment being the way to have a good life. But also, a lot of the reports talk about you can't be what you can't see, and your aspiration being grounded in what you can see around you. So there's a disconnect between aspiration and opportunity, and also the employers that are around there as well. So again, sustainable models need to be co-designed with those local employers and opportunities, and be real jobs in places, and include that wraparound to support sustain employment over time. So finally, from us, I think we know as a role of philanthropy, we can be a catalyst, we can be a strategic partner, we can be a convener, and we can be a lever for co-investment to help support with the impact economy on tackle this this intractable issue that we're facing. But I do think, and there was talks about plans and strategies this morning, I do think that place can only do so much. And I do think there needs to be a clear national strategy, and place can't operate in isolation. So, we've got the National Youth Strategy, we've got Get Britain Working, we've got the Youth Guarantee, we've got the initial findings of the Milburn Review, we've got the findings from what Social Mobility Commission have come up with. But we need a clear long-term national cross-departmental youth employment strategy that's co-owned at a government level with that Venn diagram that sits for the different departments. So DCMS, DWP, DFE and MHCLG, all whose portfolio responsibilities sit with youth employment right at the centre. So those siloed vertical inputs that we keep getting at the moment, it's not enough to solve what's a collective action problem. It's like trying to complete a jigsaw without having all the pieces. And we need to be thinking about not just what an alternative to this government's doing, but what's going to happen for the next 10 years. And we don't need to be overly prescriptive. We can set that out in principles and resource. And with the devolution agenda, let local areas meet the needs of their localities where they are at that starting point and report back. So for me, we need to build on place-based assets, create consistency and scale, and set a clear direction. And I don't want to talk too much about AI, but I do think for the types of communities that often get targeted with national programmes, we do need to acknowledge that for some of those communities, AI may end up taking a lot of entry-level jobs that young people would have accessed. So any national plan needs to factor in some sort of mitigation, upskilling or supporting for young people who are struggling to get on the labour market ladder anyway, and now face even more of a barrier.
Yeah, I'm not sure AI will just take entry-level jobs, just to be clear. It might be pressure on quite a few different sectors and professions. Anyway, I can see a lot of nodding heads around the room, some of the comments you were making there, but I want to really open now the floor to you for questions. And four hands have shot up. So I'm going to start with the lady over there. I'll have to say who you are, who you represent, and then I'll come around.
My name is Annie Reid, I'm Chief Executive of Social Mobility Charity Wigan. We're a place-based approach charity. We take an intelligence-led approach, so we work with DWP and other locations, but we've also had big conversations with young people and employers to change our provision at place. Everything that the panel has said, I welcome, and I imagine everybody in this room has got solutions that they're delivering locally. But I want to highlight a gap. This is absolute social system change crisis, and I'm looking for a solution in the behaviour change part of this that we're forgetting about at the moment. So social system change requires infrastructure change, process change, but behaviour change. Behaviour change by those that are affected by the challenge, so that's young people and employers, and those that can affect the change. So that's by all of us, that's by society, that's by employers as well. And if we don't do all three at the same time, 85% of social system change fails, and only 15% is sustainable long term. So we can talk in the room, we're all working really hard on this. It's changed the infrastructure, so public transport links, cost of public transport, all the different systems that need to be put in place, education, and we can put all the processes in place that we want as well, like Leigh Mind the Gap and other programmes that are working on this. But if we don't change the behaviours at the same time, we're going to get young people ready for work, and we're going to let them down because employers won't be ready to employ them. Or we're going to get employers ready to employ young people, and young people won't be ready to be employed because so we'll let employers down. So the gap that I see in this is a behaviour change across the nationally, because we're doing it locally, and we've got amazing employer partners that are thinking actively about how they employ young people. But we've got 85% of our local employment in SMEs, so we're having to talk to hundreds of employees rather than the big employers. And you've got one-man garages that can make a difference to a 19-year-old's life. But actually, there's a real disconnect between what we've got 5 generations in the same workforce now, and we're seeing an intergenerational gap which we're trying to solve as well. So the gap for me, and I'd be really interested if anybody's solved this, or willing to talk about it, is the behaviour change gap that needs to happen alongside this discussion of infrastructure change and process change and short-term and long-term funding as well.
I'm going to take a few questions before I come back to the panel with any comments you want to make. Yes, gentleman in the white shirt.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Really, really enjoyed that this morning. Just a quick comment and an observation. Look at Place Matters. Place Matters is a good example since 2019 that charities pulling together investment in places as longer term as well. It's very relevant to the agenda. The question is, we've had evolution. Remember, we had evolution in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There are examples going on there about what happened when we go local. And while there's a lot of good that can be done, there's inherent risk as well. That inherent risk is you just have a transfer of the centralisation of control and power. One of the criticisms against Scotland is that power is controlled and the local authorities in Scotland don't have the latitude to do what has to be done locally as well. The one thing we have to work about, we have to be sensitive to, if we are going to get the ball, we still have to have that mindset and it's about the local. The question is about scale. What scale are we talking about? Scale in the region, the local authority, but I would argue it needs to be the scale of the region.
Thank you. And there was one other question, gentleman on the end.
Observation and a question. From my point of view, I'm government psychologist at London South Bank University. You might have seen my bio for about the transition burden falls particularly on families, and the evolution aspect almost looks like stone soup as to where your bowl lands within the community as it's cascaded down. And the burden of that actually, my observation, talking to families, my studies as a development psychologist, is a social, economic, biopsychosocial model, pressure within the family. The dialogue, all what we're talking about here, first and foremost, isn't enacted through the anticipatory approach of the Equalities Act. A lot of what we're seeing isn't enacted and moved on because the anticipatory approach of the Equalities Act isn't enforced. So when it isn't enforced, those families are pressurized, go through EHCP systems, meets challenges, and those families don't understand where their role lands in that evolutionized process.
Thank you. I've got one question at the front here.
It was sort of a question slash an observation, I guess. I hear your point around connected solution. I'm absolutely not saying that we've cracked it at all, but we're trying to. So I'm from People Plus, we're a large national organisation that has delivered apprenticeship, skills provision, restart, work programme, we deliver education within prisons, and we support a lot of the short, medium, and long-term programmes into work. And having run our skills business prior to devolution, we had lots of national employers that when devolution kicked in, suddenly went, oh, so you can't help us anymore in Manchester and Newcastle, you can only help us in the areas you've got funding in. And we decided to set up a dot connecting service where we've attempted, we've supported 14,000 people so far by giving a brokerage sort of service to large employers to connect them with skills, apprenticeship, BCSEs, charities, providers to try and provide that kind of dot connecting service. We work agnostic of funding stream because I think that is a challenge where employer wants to work with something and then the funding ends.
Yeah.
So I think a dot connecting, I'm sure you'll know Anne Milton, she chairs our advocacy group, and we've attempted to do it. So if anyone wants to have a conversation about being involved with that, very happy to. We haven't solved it, but we are trying to do our part.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each member of the panel a minute to pick up any of those points or any final points you want to make of your own, because I've been told I need to finish at 1:50. I think you'll need to have lunch. So we'll go from the far end to this end. So Paul, if you want to kick us off with any answers or anything else you want to say.
Yeah, no, just on Ali's point, I think one of the things around behaviour change is it's probably not going to happen by osmosis. And I think we need to make sure the incentives are pointed in the right direction. And I don't think those necessarily are at the moment. So I think every NEET programme that I've ever been involved with or funded or heard of has improved young people's life opportunities or employment. But yet we've gone backwards over the last 25 years. So actually, where is kind of that shared truth around the difficulties, what doesn't work, and how we can start to learn from each other rather than feeling, especially voluntary sector organisations, feeling so under pressure and accountable that they have to show the most beautiful face all the time and they can't share actually that deep learning that will stop wasting time within the system. And how do we understand what good looks like? I think sometimes in this space, it's about more is better, not better being better. So I think we have to get those incentives right. I think also we need to understand that any piece of work that people are doing, it's if it's a project and it's time limited, it's proof of concept of the wider change you want to see. So how then is that built into local systems, communicated effectively and collectively, so that we can start to make a difference? Because individual organisations doing things with local communities with the best will in the world isn't going to start to shift the levers that probably regional and national government have got. So I think we need to think about, when we link it to the devolution point, is where are the learning mechanisms between those different layers and the great work to the policy change? So what's happening at community level? How does that communicate with local authorities? How do they communicate with combined authorities, and how do they communicate with government? Because only over time, where we have those in place, will we start to see that behaviour change.
30 seconds.
30 seconds, yeah.
Okay. I would just like to pick up on behaviour change piece, just because it's hearts and minds, and it will always be hearts and minds, and that will not change. I think, back to your challenge on evaluation, like data and evaluation, important to do that. And actually building that evidence base through some of our place-based working is absolutely where we start and end in terms of tackling that system. I would also say that statutory change is really important. I'm leading a whole programme about building the evidence base of employer hiring practice and retention practice. There is no data out there to show us how to do it well. And actually, we can prove some of these things, such as, say, for example, salary transparency or job descriptions. If we can get statutory support to implement those things, that's where you get the practice and the behaviour, because that's how we do stuff.
Brilliantly done in 30 seconds.
I'll try it.
Yeah.
Behaviour change, completely agreed. The vast majority of the employers we work with are SMEs for our apprentices, not obviously our other young people. We need people to be brave. Take 16 to 18 apprenticeships out the levy completely. Reframe them as mandatory education, because other 16 to 18-year-olds fully paid for by the government in our classrooms. I've got 4,500 of them. They're fully paid. My other 16 to 18-year-olds, they're just the same. Then employers know they're not just getting an employee. We don't have to then give them the wage increase that have been given to apprentices, I'm afraid, has killed the market in the last 12 months. Then it changes the wage. These are mandatory education young people who need something financially to get them to work back, but they're not to be treated as employees. And that's a much more honest behaviour change piece. And just very quickly on devolution, we don't have 16 to 18 devolution funding devolved. My view is it's a national programme, 16 to 18. There are things that work through devolution, and there are things that need to be looked after nationally. And I think, therefore, you have to look at devolution in a very nuanced way.
Thank you. Debbie.
I think running through everything we talked about today, there's behaviour and there's culture. And unless we can change the culture of individuals and, government organisations and other organisations, but they're all struggling to survive. And that will drive their culture and that will drive their behaviour. So some way of getting people together and trying to give sustainable funding for a period to do the job properly is critical. And I would say that data across everything that we do, there's just so little of it. The thing that staggers me is that there's an estimate that there's 1 million NEETs. Nobody truly knows how many there are, who they are, and where they are. And I think data is a great thing that we need to work on.
Great, thank you, Debbie. So I'm going to just bring things to a conclusion by thanking you for the questions and comments you've just put to the panel. And also I'd like to thank the panel for their brilliant contributions and answering the questions that I've asked them and you've asked them today. Just a few things that I think stood out for me. Firstly, I think that place clearly matters.
Yes.
And matters a great deal. And it matters because opportunities are so unevenly distributed around the country. Second, I think skills and economic growth must go together. We can't train young people for jobs that don't exist. And third, local leadership actually matters. But it must be matched by accountability, capacity, and capacity is really quite important, and long-term investment. Yeah. All this short-termism gets us nowhere. And the challenge isn't choosing between national and local approaches. It's about finding the right balance between the two, I think, as you've said, Anna. So as the Mobility Commission continues to develop its work on these place-based approaches, the insights we've gathered today and in other sessions as well that are either going to happen or happening simultaneously, this is going to all feed into our place-based framework, which I hope we're going to be putting out later in the year.